In 1492, when Columbus landed in the Caribbean, Spain had just finished a bloody 700-year war with the Moors. This war, known as the Reconquista, was a holy war, Christian versus Muslim, with the Jews and their status mixed in. At times, during those 700 years, the Moors established peaceful kingdoms, where scholarly learning was valued and many scientific discoveries took place. At others, notably during Alfonso X's time, the Christians opened their doors to scholarly development. But even during those times, there were always skirmishes, a giving and taking of land. At one time, the Moors possessed all of the Iberian Peninsula other than what today is known as the Basque Lands, and northern Portugal and Galicia in Spain. The Moors were only stopped by the Pyrenees from entering France and the other mountainous areas of the peninsula from taking over completely. Slowly but surely, the Christians took back their lands. The method that they used was one of conquer and destroy first, and then give the land to the soldiers as reward for their valor. The soldiers became rich this way and settled down as landowners. This encouraged young men to become part of the war machine. Once the war ended, however, all of the young men currently serving had nowhere to go, no employment, and no possibility of acquiring their own land. These are the people who jumped at the chance of exploring the New World, hoping to make it rich quickly, to settle down and rely on others to work for them. They set off, determining to take as much as they could from the New World that they were headed to in order to become important in the Old World, which they were leaving. The Portuguese, encouraged by their monarch, were the first to set out exploring, mainly Africa at first. They had been doing this for almost a century before Spain could rid itself finally of the Moors and concentrate on new territories. During the Portuguese push down the African coast, they established a number of factories that were small trading forts, usually located on islands, garrisoned by a few Portuguese that offered the various companies' factors a safe place to carry out trade with the local people. The factory system was an excellent way of establishing a permanent commercial presence in an area without the cost of conquest or settlement. When the Portuguese did pursue colonization and settled in an area, they used a system known as the donatary captaincy. The Spanish used a similar system in the New World called the encomienda. Both systems drew upon the medieval precedent of the Iberian lordly domain, señorío, but adapted it to the new imperial goal of capitalistic agricultural development. A nobleman would be granted the hereditary title to the land, economic concessions, and a certain amount of political and judicial autonomy. In exchange, he agreed to administer and develop that territory. The crown worked closely with individuals and companies alike, because the factory and the donatary captaincy, encomienda, cost the crown very little at the initial and most risky stage of exploration and development. Thus, all three commercial institutions provided time-tested mechanisms for investing capital, financing expeditions, and development of new territories that would drive the explorations and colonization of Africa, the Atlantic, Asia, and eventually the New World. The claim of Spain to these lands was solidified by the Intercaetera Papal Bull of 1493 and by the immediately following Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, in which the globe was divided into two hemispheres between Spanish and Portuguese claims. These actions gave Spain exclusive rights to establish colonies in all of the New World, from Alaska to Cape Horn, except Brazil, as well as the easternmost parts of Asia. Now let us contrast that with the situation of the British who came to the New World. Early settlers had a variety of reasons for seeking a new homeland. The Pilgrims of Massachusetts were pious, self-disciplined English people who wanted to escape religious persecution. Other colonies, such as Virginia, were founded principally as business ventures. Often, though, piety and profits went hand in hand. England's success at colonizing what would become the U.S. was due in large part to its use of charter companies. Charter companies were groups of stockholders, usually merchants and wealthy landowners, who sought personal economic gain and perhaps also wanted to advance England's national goals. While the private sector financed the companies, the king provided each project with a charter, or grant, conferring economic rights as well as political and judicial authority. The colonies generally did not show quick profits, however, and the English investors often turned over their colonial charters to the settlers. The political implications, although not realized at the time, were enormous. The colonists were left to build their own lives, their own communities, and their own economy, in effect to start constructing the rudiments of a new nation. Apart from the time difference, a century passes for the Spaniards to explore and conquer before the first settlement of people from England arrived. Perhaps the largest difference between the two settlements was who made the journey from Old World to New World? Only men came on the conquest from Spain and Portugal. Women accompanied the first settlers from England. Quite a contrast to the Iberian medieval system. The conquest of Latin America by Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, let alone the other conquistadores, has been touched on in the other PowerPoint for this unit. It involves sneaky tactics, violent repression, slavery, and most particularly the spread of European diseases through the Americas. When the Europeans first reached the New World, there were millions of indigenous people. By the end of the first era, more than two-thirds of the indigenous populations had been wiped out, reducing their numbers to the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. However, there had been enough interrelations between the Europeans and the indigenous to form a new race of people, the mestizos. People of mixed white and indigenous blood. These are the people who form the majority of the population in many of the Latin American countries today. The rest of this PowerPoint is going to focus on the next two eras, while the rest of this course will focus on the current era. In 1496, one of Columbus's sons founded the city of Santo Domingo. It is the oldest continuously occupied city in the Americas. It remained under Spanish rule without interruption for almost a century. In 1512, the first nationally codified set of laws governing the behavior of Spanish settlers in America were passed in Spain. They forbade the maltreatment of natives, endorsed their conversion to Catholicism, and legalized the colonial practice of creating encomiendas, where Indians were grouped together to work under colonial masters. The Spanish crown found it difficult to enforce these laws because of the distance. The Spanish governors began importing slaves from Africa for labor. In 1517, Charles V authorized slaves. The Tainos became virtually but not completely extinct on the island of Hispaniola. Some who evaded capture fled to the mountains and established independent settlements. Survivors mixed with escaped slaves, runaways called Maroons, and produced a multiracial generation called Zambos. As a gateway to the Caribbean, Hispaniola became a haven for pirates. The western part of the island was settled by French buccaneers. Among them was Bertrand de Obregon, who succeeded in growing tobacco. His success prompted many of the numerous buccaneers and freebooters to turn into settlers. This population did not submit to Spanish royal authority until the year 1660 and caused a number of conflicts. In 1605, because of the pirates, the Spanish monarchy ordered all of the Spaniards of Hispaniola to move to the vicinity of Santo Domingo. This period was called the Devastaciones because everyone lost everything they had owned, and most people not associated either with the pirates or the defense of Santo Domingo fled. Constant hostilities existed on the island between the French pirate settlers and the original Spanish inhabitants. This was settled by the Treaty of Ryswick, 1697. This divided the island into half. The French named their half Saint-Domingue, which is today modern Haiti. In 1791, the first independence movement of Latin America started with a slave revolt in Saint-Domingue. The first Republic of Haiti was started in 1794, although officially independence was fully declared in 1804. During this process, the Spaniards had been forced out of Santo Domingo, only to be replaced by French nationalists. The Dominican Republic declared its independence for the first time in 1821, but Haiti quickly took it over. Final independence was achieved in 1844. After the conquest, it did not take long for what was originally Tenochtitlan to become Mexico City. By 1521, it had been established as the capital of New Spain, second only to Peru in importance. The first English-speaking settlers arrived in Jamestown in 1607. By 1620, when the Pilgrims were still establishing themselves, Mexico City had a daily newspaper, a university, and a cathedral. Harvard was not founded until 1636, while the first colonial printing press is not set up until 1638 in the U.S. By the standards at the time, Mexico City was a booming metropolis with close to 500,000 people. In contrast, the British colonies did not reach 250,000 people until almost 1700. The silver being found in New Spain and the convenience of New Spain being between both oceans versus Peru, whose access to the Atlantic Ocean was impeded by Portuguese territories, led New Spain to take over from Peru as the most important province in the New World in the 1670s. Spain instituted viceroyalties to govern the area, the vice-regent being a noble from Spain who could only hold the title for a few years and who could neither own property in the New World nor marry anyone from the New World. Both England and Spain prohibited direct trading between anyone but themselves. In other words, goods from the British colonies could only be traded with England, while goods from the Spanish colonies could only be traded with Spain. What was most important to the Spanish crown was receiving revenues, either in the shape of silver, gold, or other natural resources, such as indigo or human bodies, to maintain its European wars. Because of the distance and the slowness of communication, much of the government was run as the locals saw fit. This autonomy was viewed distastefully in Europe. As a result, there were more and more laws passed trying to limit autonomous government, to increase money sent to Europe through taxation, and stricter controls with less and less involvement locally. These were called the Bourbon reforms. This is comparable to the situation in the U.S., where the theme taxation without representation became common. While the British government was enacting more and more taxes, so was the Spanish government. Things came to a head in North America between 1773 and 1776, resulting in complete independence of the United States in 1784. Much of what happens in the United States will serve as a model for the rest of the Americas. The crisis in Mexico and much of Latin America starts with the Spanish crown expelling the Jesuits, the bulk of the religious fathers in Latin America. This direct attack on the church is not well received by the populace. However, it is not until the Napoleonic crisis in 1808 that the independence movement of Mexico, and indeed most of the rest of Latin America, starts. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte sends his troops through Spain in order to attack Portugal. While he is there, he calmly takes over Spain with little or no resistance from the monarchy, who promptly moves to France and abdicates. The only opposition that Napoleon faces is from local militias. The royal army does not resist the takeover. The people of Spain object tremendously and set up local juntas, governments, on the excuse that without the king present, there was no official government in place. In 1808, these juntas were adopted into government in Mexico. Up until now, what had taken place in Mexico had been mainly political maneuvering between royal factions. In 1810, however, with a grito de dolores, on September 16th, Father Miguel Hidalgo starts the Mexican War of Independence. This is a frequently bloody, disorganized war that lasts for 11 years. Finally, the war is declared over, and Mexico, which includes Central America, except Panama, which is part of Colombia, wins its independence in 1821. For the first time, the United States of America achieved something ahead of the United States of Mexico, its independence some 40 years earlier. From this time on, the United States will surge ahead of Latin America in terms of population growth, economic growth, scientific invention, and political. South America was divided into 3 viceroyalties. The first was the Viceroyalty of Peru, created in 1542, Nueva Granada in 1739, and finally Rio de la Plata, 1776. The Viceroyalty of Peru, whose capital was Lima, initially was in charge of all of the Spanish portion of South America, except part of the coast of Venezuela. It lost control of the northern portion in 1739 with the creation of Nueva Granada, which encompassed Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela, with Bogotá as the capital. The last division was made in 1776, separating off Paraguay, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Argentina into the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, with Buenos Aires as the capital. Between the conquest and independence was a time of great activity with the Church. All of the different brotherhoods, Dominicans, Augustins, Franciscans, Jesuits, were present and anxious to convert the indigenous. At the same time, the conquerors started settling down, sending for their wives and children, becoming hacenderos, landowners of what would become the great haciendas. Government from Spain tended to be inefficient due to the distance and the slowness of communication. It could take 6 months for a question to get to Spain and a reply to reach the colonies. To the Habsburg kings, the only truly important issue was how much revenue could be extracted from the New World. Once the Bourbons came to throne, after many concessions in the War of Succession in Europe, they tended to view government from a different perspective. They believed in being enlightened despots. So where on one hand more autonomy was given to the colonies, more controls for efficiency were put into place. Taxation became higher, and more money and goods were sent back to Europe, sometimes not leaving any behind for the residents. This led to the first attempt at independence of South America, which was led by Francisco de Miranda. He was an educated man who had traveled extensively and participated in many wars, including the French Revolution. He had met with George Washington and many of the United States leaders of independence. From these encounters, he became an impassionate proponent for the independence of South America. His vision was one of an independent empire stretching from the Mississippi to Cape Horn. There would be a hereditary emperor called the Inca to honor the Incan empire, and would have a legislature based on that of the government of the United States. As England was at war with Spain because of Napoleon, Miranda sought their help in seeking the independence of South America. Their help was informal. Miranda set out with troops aboard 3 ships and landed in Venezuela. Although they quickly captured La Vela de Coro, none of the locals were in support of independence, so Miranda and his troops had to withdraw. Their mission failed. This was in 1806, before Spain was invaded by Napoleon. However, Miranda did design specifically for this mission the Venezuelan flag that is still in use today. He is considered a forerunner for Simón Bolívar, the great liberator. Unfortunately, Miranda was handed over to the Spaniards as a traitor by Bolívar himself in 1812, and Miranda died in a Spanish prison in 1816. Today, he is considered a great hero in Venezuela. Simón Bolívar shared Miranda's vision of a united independent state that was all of the countries of South America. However, he was realistic in realizing that due to the frailties and greed of human nature, this would probably never happen. He also differed from Miranda in that he did not want an emperor to be in charge, but wanted a duly elected representative, much like the United States. The other difference between their visions was that Bolívar sought the unification of South America, not all the Spanish and Portuguese lands. They did agree on Colombia, after Christopher Columbus, as the name of the new country, although Bolívar always referred to it as Gran Colombia. The reading in the textbook describes more thoroughly his plans for independence. Between the first declaration of independence of Venezuela in 1808, Bolívar and the Republican troops with him skirmished and fought against the royalists of Spain. Finally, with much loss of life and property, in 1821 the Campaña Admirable came to an end, and Gran Colombia was created with Bolívar as its leader, at least temporarily. Gran Colombia included modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. In 1824, Peru was given to him, and in 1825, Bolivia was formed. Simón Bolívar had succeeded in uniting much of South America in a federation free from Spanish control, but the government was fragile. Despite his desire to create a union of states similar to that which created the United States of America, Bolívar faced opposition from internal factions throughout the huge Gran Colombia. As a temporary measure, Bolívar declared himself dictator in 1828. He resigned this post in 1830 and made plans to sail for exile in Europe. However, he died in December of that year, after a battle with tuberculosis. Paraguay was the first country to officially declare its independence from Spain in 1811. It was on the whole a peaceful transition, not prolonged by bloody wars of independence. However, their independence from Argentina did not officially come until 1840. Up until then, they had a non-aggression pact in place whereby Argentina would not attack them. This is the only country in South America not to suffer loss of people, income, or property in independence. It simply happened. Paraguay was considered unimportant to the crown, and so was allowed to quietly disappear. Because of its future history of wars that tear the country apart, it is fortunate to have been spared this war. José de San Martín was Simón Bolívar's counterpart in southern South America. Having fought with the Spaniards against the French in Spain, when he arrived in Argentina in 1812, he joined the War of Independence on the Argentinian side. A native son of the area, his expertise was appreciated, and he quickly rose in rank from lieutenant colonel to general. On completing the fight for Argentinian independence, he wished to continue liberating the rest of the area, specifically Chile and Peru. Chile had been involved in wars of independence, but Peru was a royalist stronghold at the time. San Martín's greatest accomplishment, leaving him historically parallel to Hannibal, was the fact that he took his army in 1817 through the Andes Mountains and took Santiago de Chile. He was offered the leadership of Chile, but refused, as his goal was then Peru. In 1821, San Martín liberates Lima. At this point, Bolívar was also liberating parts of Peru, and in 1822, the two great generals meet for the first time. After the first meeting, San Martín withdraws from the wars of independence, leaving the rest of Peru to Bolívar, soon thereafter leaving South America completely for France, because, as he stated, the presence of a successful soldier, no matter how disinterested, is dangerous to the states that have just been constituted. With this retirement, San Martin proved to be a truly selfless individual who wanted the good of the region rather than personal profit. Extremely unusual. On September 18, 1810, a meeting in Santiago, Chile, opted for limited self-government until the Spanish throne was restored. For many people, including Bernardo O'Higgins, a wealthy young hacendero who had traveled to Europe and who had spent time with Miranda, limited self-government was not enough. They wanted complete independence. O'Higgins was a wealthy man and could afford to form 2 cavalry companies with the peasants who worked his estates. He was aware of his lack of military awareness and so was given essential military training by Colonel Juan Maquena. At the Sorpresa del Roble in 1813, he led a cavalry charge against the royalist factions. His words, "O vivir con honor o morir con gloria, el que sea valiente que me siga, we can live with honor or die with glory. If you have the courage, follow me," are part of Chilean history. Later in the war, O'Higgins suffered a defeat at the Battle of Rancagua, where he lost most of his troops and was almost captured himself. He and the men that he had left escaped to Chile and joined with San Martin in his efforts and accompanied him on his journey to liberate Chile and Peru. When Santiago is freed and the people want San Martin to rule, and he refuses, they then put up O'Higgins as the dictator of Chile. He ruled successfully for 6 years, building up the Chilean navy and trying to institute as many reforms as he could, such as the abolition of titles and nobility and democracy. As a result, he alienated the bulk of the moneyed elite in Chile and was finally deposed and sent to Peru, where he finished out his life. The natives that the Portuguese discovered on claiming Brazil as a colony were not highly developed peoples. However, rather than the immediate onslaught of brutality that occurred in the Spanish lands, the Portuguese showed little interest in Brazil once claimed. There were Portuguese who lived there cultivating relationships with the natives in order to extract Brazil wood, which was used in Europe to create a red dye. But it wasn't until the Portuguese realized that people from France and England were taking advantage of a lack of Portuguese presence to go to Brazil and take Brazil wood for themselves that they decided to show some interest in the land. Colonization did not begin until 1530. The Crown established capitanías hereditarias to stimulate colonization. These private investors bought lands from the Crown and developed them. Out of an original 15 capitanías, only 2 thrived. They were concerned with 2 economic activities that defined Brazil: sugarcane processing and the slave trade. The readings that you are going to do, or have done, deal with these issues. Because the Amazon jungle is so inhospitable, it restricted the development and exploration of the area. There ended up being 2 types of explorations: entradas and bandeiras. Entradas were sponsored by the Crown and were only searching for mineral wealth. The bandeiras were private enterprises, not only searching for mineral wealth, but also searching for natives to enslave. There were also settlements of runaway slaves and natives called quilombos that private enterprise and the Crown, for that matter, wanted to conquer. Finally, in the late 1690s, gold was discovered by the bandeirantes near Minas Gerais. This is what the Crown had been waiting for. A boom in development occurred as a result. Then in 1729, diamonds were found, assuring the success of the colony. From there, the importance of Brazil to Portugal kept rising. The government of Portugal was not as controlling as that of Spain, and as a result there was not as much hostility towards the monarchy as it resulted in the rest of South America, especially with the monarchy moving its headquarters to Brazil for the duration of the Napoleonic Wars. Brazil is an interesting case in Latin American independence. It was the only country to have a monarchy descended from the royal family of Portugal as its first rulers. When Napoleon attacked Portugal, the royal family fled to Brazil, where they held court until 1822. In 1821, the royal family returned to Portugal, leaving Pedro I of Brazil behind. In 1822, Pedro I declares Brazil an independent empire. From 1822, members of the Portuguese royal family ruled Brazil until 1889, when Pedro II is deposed by a military coup. True independence from Portugal starts at that time. As a side note, at this time, modern-day Uruguay achieved its independence from both Argentina and Brazil between 1811 and 1830. They officially declared their independence in 1825. Prior to that, this area was an area of dispute between Spanish and Portuguese governments. Uruguay bounced back and forth, sometimes belonging to one country, sometimes the other. Uruguay, as it was created, was meant to be a buffer zone between them. Perhaps because of this tug-of-war approach to the land, even after independence, Uruguay was racked with civil wars throughout the 1800s. So none of the great liberators of South America, Bolivar, San Martin, O'Higgins, were destined to lead their countries for any great period of time. Unlike the United States, where the generals of the Liberation Army were elected as our presidents, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, at the beginning of our nation. If you examine the maps on the slide, they show in the center of the situation before the Wars of Independence, the U.S. as of 1790, and a listing of all the independence movements in Latin America and the Caribbean. The item least discussed about these wars was the devastating effect they had on the local economies. All these countries ended their wars with significant foreign debt. Local production was at a standstill as the majority of the men capable of working the land or industry were gone to war. The loss of life, which when reported by historians seems insignificant, 100 men lost here, 2,000 there, was horrific. Also the land took many years to recover physically from the men tramping through the fields, burning the land to prevent the opposition from harvesting crops, etc. This could be the key as to the turning of the economies. In Latin America there was no gentle transfer of power. Battles were fought for many years as different elites strived for dominance. There were no free elections in Latin America. They were ruled by dictators until opinions changed when there would be a coup and a new dictator was installed. Even though the U.S. was not free from war during this period, note the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, etc., it was more or less a united country until the Civil War. The borders of the countries we talk about today as Latin America are still under dispute in some areas. This final listing of the Caribbean represents the rest of the islands, all of which either achieved independence well into the current era that we will examine during the rest of the semester, or which are still colonies with varying degrees of autonomy.